San Francisco in the middle 60s was a very special time and place to be a part of. But no explanation, no mix of words or music or memories can touch that sense of knowing that you were there and alive in that corner of time in the world, whatever it meant.
The hippie dream didn't disappear in a single moment. It didn't end at Woodstock, and it didn't collapse because people suddenly stopped believing in love, peace, or art. According to the people who actually lived inside Laurel Canyon, it faded when the culture around music changed, when money accelerated everything, when trust eroded, and when a faster, harder party lifestyle took hold. In Laurel Canyon, inside the story of rock and roll's legendary neighborhood, Michael Walker documents this transformation not as a morality tale, but as a social one. What began as a loose, trusting, creative village became an industry-driven pressure cooker, and once that happened, nothing felt the same. In the mid-1960s, Laurel Canyon was uniquely isolated. The winding roads and modest homes created a physical barrier between artists and the outside world. Musicians wandered into each other's houses unannounced. Songs were shared freely, credit wasn't guarded. Walker and many first-hand accounts describe a scene built on openness and long, meandering conversations. The substances most commonly associated with that early period were marijuana and LSD, not framed as party enhancers, but as part of a slower, introspective, communal culture. People sat around for hours talking about ideas, lyrics, politics, and philosophy. Music reflected that pace. Songs were exploratory, patient, and emotionally vulnerable. That environment depended entirely on trust. Trust that ideas wouldn't be stolen. Trust that friends weren't keeping score. Trust that the community mattered more than individual leverage. Walker emphasizes that this wasn't naive innocence. It was a shared understanding that the music came first and that everyone benefited when creativity stayed open. For a brief moment, Laurel Canyon functioned less like an industry hub and more like a shared artistic experiment. As the late 1960s approached, everything accelerated. The music industry recognized the financial power of this scene. Albums sold in unprecedented numbers. Tours grew longer and more demanding. Money arrived quickly and unevenly. Walker makes a critical point here. The culture didn't simply change because of personal excess. It changed because the incentives changed. Labels expected constant output. Managers pushed for bigger tours. Privacy disappeared. The relaxed pace that once defined the canyon became impossible to maintain. With money came a new lifestyle. Where earlier psychedelic culture emphasized openness and ego softening, the new stimulant-driven party culture rewarded confidence, speed, and dominance. Multiple people Walker interviews described the same emotional shift. Conversations became guarded. Motives felt unclear. People stopped speaking freely. For the first time, musicians began asking a quiet but corrosive question. Who can I trust? This loss of trust wasn't dramatic at first. It showed up in small ways. People stopped leaving doors unlocked. Ideas were held back. Managers and lawyers became permanent fixtures in rooms that once held only guitars and notebooks. The earlier sense of shared purpose gave way to competition. Walker documents how paranoia, social, not clinical, became part of daily life. Who was leaking stories? Who was angling for a solo deal? Who was about to leave the band? One of the clearest early warning signs of this breakdown involved Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Wilson embodied the open-door generosity of the earlier Canyon era. In 1968, that openness led him into contact with Charles Manson, then an unknown figure attempting to gain access to the music industry. Wilson allowed Manson and members of his group to stay at his home and attempted briefly to help him make industry connections. What followed was not sensationalized in Walker's telling. It was sobering. Time, money, and energy were consumed. The situation became threatening. Wilson eventually cut ties completely and distanced himself. After the murders that shocked the country in 1969, many inside Laurel Canyon looked back on the episode with a new understanding. The openness that once felt beautiful had become risky. Trust, once automatic, now required caution. Walker places this episode inside a broader pattern. The same environment that once rewarded vulnerability now attracted manipulation. People learned, sometimes painfully, that openness could be exploited. That lesson rippled through the canyon. Relationships became more transactional. Guardedness replaced warmth. The sense of safety that once defined the community evaporated. By the early 1970s, the music itself reflected the shift. Songs became tighter, louder, more aggressive. Albums became products shaped by deadlines. Tours became endurance tests. The industry rewarded output and image over reflection. This was also the era when record labels began quietly acknowledging the realities of the lifestyle they were promoting. Multiple industry insiders have since confirmed that recording contracts began including discretionary budgets, money that everyone understood would cover living expenses during sessions. Those expenses often included drugs. What had once been informal became institutionalized. As the 1970s progressed, the music industry didn't just tolerate excess, it quietly planned for it. Multiple former executives, producers, and artists have since confirmed that by the early to mid-70s, record contracts often included broad, loosely defined expense categories. These weren't labeled explicitly, but everyone understood what they were for. Studio time stretched through the night, touring schedules became relentless, and the lifestyle that emerged around those demands was no longer accidental. It was budgeted. The logic was simple. Albums were expensive. Tours were exhausting. Labels expected constant output, and they expected artists to be available at all hours. Long nights in the studio blurred into early mornings. Tours stacked city after city with little rest in between. Musicians weren't being asked to slow down. They were being asked to produce more, faster, and louder than ever before. And to keep that pace, a stimulant-driven culture became normalized behind the scenes. One of the most frequently cited examples of this era is Black Sabbath during the recording of Volume 4. The band themselves have spoken openly years later about how extreme that period was. Recording sessions stretched endlessly. Sleep became irregular. The environment was chaotic, unfocused, and fueled by constant pressure to deliver something heavier and more intense than what came before. They actually thank the great Coca Company of Los Angeles on the back of the album. Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne have both described Volume 4 as an album made during a time of near total excess. Not because it was glamorous, but because the workload felt unmanageable. The band was recording, touring, promoting, and being pushed forward without pause. In hindsight, they've acknowledged that what seemed like energy at the time was actually exhaustion masked by stimulation. The result was an album that sounded powerful, but came at a steep personal cost. Importantly, this wasn't unique to Black Sabbath. Across genres, musicians began describing the same cycle: late-night sessions followed by early flights, tour buses that never stopped moving, studio deadlines that ignored human limits. Under those conditions, stimulant use wasn't framed as indulgence. It was framed as survival. Something to keep people awake. Something to keep the machine running. Record companies rarely intervened. In fact, many quietly enabled the cycle. As long as albums were delivered and tours sold out, the human toll stayed off the books. What had once been a counterculture defined by creativity and reflection became an industrial process driven by speed. The music industry didn't just respond to this culture, it reinforced it. This is where the contrast with the earlier Laurel Canyon era becomes impossible to ignore. In the mid-1960s, creativity happened slowly. People wrote songs sitting on floors, talking for hours, sharing meals, and trusting each other. By the mid-1970s, creativity happened under fluorescent lights at 3 a.m, with lawyers waiting outside the room and tour dates already booked before the album was finished. Many musicians later said the same thing. They weren't trying to escape reality. they were trying to keep up with it. The expectations placed on them were no longer human. They were commercial, and the tools they used reflected that shift. Looking back, it becomes clear that the problem wasn't just substances. It was a system that demanded endless output without rest. A system that mistook stamina for creativity. A system that rewarded people for ignoring their limits. The earlier psychedelic era slowed people down and opened conversations. The new stimulant-driven era sped everything up and closed them. By the time the decade ended, the consequences were visible everywhere. Burned out artists, broken bands, fortunes lost, trust gone. The music survived, but the community that once supported it didn't. The industry kept moving forward, but the dream that built it was already gone. This change had consequences, and they weren't evenly distributed. Nowhere is this more visible than in the story of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. On the surface, the group represented harmony, idealism, and political consciousness. Behind the scenes, however, the pressure of fame, money, and lifestyle differences exposed deep fractures. David Crosby and Stephen Stills, both extraordinarily talented, struggled profoundly during this era. Their finances deteriorated, relationships fractured, legal and personal troubles mounted. Neil Young and Graham Nash, by contrast, remained financially stable and professionally disciplined. The difference wasn't talent, it was structure, boundaries, and how each navigated the escalating culture around them. Several biographers and band insiders have noted that those who retained control over their schedules and finances were far less destabilized by the new lifestyle than those who didn't. This pattern appears repeatedly across the industry. The people with leverage, financial security, solo success, or strong management could insulate themselves. Those without it were often overwhelmed. The culture didn't punish excess equally. It consumed the vulnerable first. Blow wasn't to blame for killing the hippie dream alone, but it definitely changed the scene and changed the scene. Eventually, the people of Laurel Canyon learned not everyone with long hair and a flower in their hair could be trusted. By the mid-1970s, the shift was unmistakable. Rock music moved fully into the arena era. Excess became normalized. Few bands symbolized this transformation more clearly than Led Zeppelin. Their tours were massive, theatrical, and unapologetically indulgent. Stories of groupies, destroyed hotel rooms, and unchecked behavior became part of the mythology. Importantly, this wasn't hidden from the industry. It was often facilitated by it. Promoters, labels, and managers understood that spectacle sold tickets. Boundaries disappeared. What Walker's analysis makes clear is that this wasn't simply decadence for decadence's sake. It was the logical endpoint of an industry that rewarded intensity, volume, and non-stop performance. When rest and reflection disappear, escalation fills the gap. The earlier psychedelic culture slowed people down. The new era sped everything up. Creativity didn't vanish, but it became more volatile. By the late 1970s, many of the people who helped build the Laurel Canyon scene were gone. Some moved away. Some burned out. Some lost nearly everything. The neighborhood itself changed. The sense of shared purpose that once defined it was gone. What remained was legacy and cautionary memory. Walker's conclusion is not that the hippie dream was naive or doomed. It's that it was fragile. It depended on trust, time, and a shared belief that art mattered more than leverage. When money, pressure, and speed replaced those values, the culture couldn't survive intact. The dream didn't die in a scandal. It dissolved in silence, one guarded conversation at a time, one locked door at a time. One question repeated quietly until it reshaped everything. Who can I trust? And once that question enters a creative community, the community has already changed.